I was halfway through a sip of my Saturday morning coffee when I spotted it, what looked like a neon-green jungle gym rising from the center of my land. Not near it. Not adjacent. Not barely touching the line. No, this thing was dead center, bolted into the soil I had personally signed for 3 years ago. Kids were already swinging, screaming, running across platforms, and somewhere in the chaos, a DJ was playing Kids Bop at full volume. There were balloons. There was a sign that read Future Site of Magnolia Hills Community Playground. And there, standing under a pop-up tent holding a clipboard and a megaphone, was a woman in a sun hat and oversized sunglasses shouting, "Welcome to your new park, neighbors." That was the moment I knew 2 things for sure. 1, I was going to need a second cup of coffee, and 2, these people had absolutely no idea I was the county land use commissioner. I should back up. My name's Mark, and about 3 years ago, I bought a half-acre lot on the edge of Magnolia Hills. A quiet, tree-lined development with far too many HOA signs and far too few people who mind their business. I bought the land not to build on immediately, but to use as a peaceful weekend escape. A fire pit, some lawn chairs, bird-watching, and silence. It was zoned residential but undeveloped, and I made sure the paperwork on that was ironclad. I'm not just picky, I'm a land use commissioner. I eat zoning laws for breakfast. That Saturday morning, I pulled up with a few bags of mulch, planning to spend the day planting. Instead, I nearly dropped my gardening gloves when I saw what they'd done. The entire front section of my lot had been stripped of grass and topsoil. In its place, rubber matting, bright plastic slides, swings, and a massive wood chip pit that looked like it was trying to swallow the horizon. There were snack tables. There was even a porta-potty. The audacity was impressive. I parked and walked over, trying to keep my jaw from hitting the gravel. A woman, blonde bob, sun hat, clipboard, and the unmistakable energy of someone who hosts wine and cheese nights to plot minor coups, spotted me. She marched over, heels crunching the mulch like she owned the place. "Hi. You must be one of the new residents. Isn't it exciting?" she chirped, extending her hand. "Karen Delacroix, HOA Board President." I didn't take her hand. "What is this?" I asked, pointing at the monstrosity. She laughed like I was joking. "Our new community playground, of course. We finally turned that abandoned lot into something useful for everyone." "That abandoned lot," I said slowly, "is my private property." Her smile didn't even flicker. "Oh, I'm sure you're mistaken. The HOA voted to repurpose it. It's on the updated plat map from last year." "Updated plat map?" I nearly laughed. Plat maps don't just get updated by wishful thinking and some fairy dust. They require legal filings, surveys, approvals, and, well, people like me. People whose desks those documents land on. I bought this land myself. I pay taxes on it. There's a deed in my name, I said, trying to remain calm. She clucked her tongue. "Well, dear, if you don't mind, we've already sent out the neighborhood newsletter and scheduled ribbon cutting next weekend. The children are very excited." I stared at her, genuinely unsure if I was being pranked. "You built a playground on private property without permission." Karen shrugged. "It's for the good of the community. Honestly, you should be thanking us. We've increased the value of your land." The sheer delusion nearly knocked me back a step. I turned and walked the perimeter of the build. It was worse than I thought. There were footings dug directly over utility lines. Someone had dragged a concrete picnic table halfway into my planting bed. The trees I'd planted last year? Gone. Ripped out, roots and all. There were kids climbing the structure barefoot while their parents sipped lattes under tents, unaware, or uncaring, that their little angels were technically trespassing. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and started taking photos. I documented everything. Signage, structures, crowds. I got shots of Karen directing people like some tyrant in a sundress. I even filmed a short video of her explaining how permits weren't necessary because, and I quote, "the HOA handles its own land now." Oh, sweet Karen. She had no idea what she'd done. Not just legally, but personally. I was someone who'd spent years navigating red tape, enforcing regulations, and making sure people followed procedure. I was the guy you did not want to get into a land use dispute with. And she had just used HOA funds to illegally install a playground on a parcel I could prove I owned, without a single permit in sight. But I didn't argue. Not yet. That's not how people like me play. I smiled and nodded and thanked her for her kindness. I said I'd check with the city and see what I could find out. She handed me a paper plate of cookies like I was one of her children. That plate was still on the front seat of my truck, untouched. By Sunday morning, I had 3 things. A copy of the original deed, aerial drone photos from the week before, showing the land untouched, and a nasty little file full of county regulations about unauthorized land use, environmental damage, and misuse of public funds. Because I also knew one other thing Karen didn't. She hadn't just overstepped. She had violated enough ordinances to shut down an entire HOA. And I was going to let her walk straight into that trap, clipboard and all. By Monday morning, I was seated at my office desk with a fresh cup of coffee and a printed packet labeled, Magnolia Hills HOA Violations, Urgent. I didn't need to ask anyone for favors. I simply opened our zoning and permit system, typed in the parcel number for my lot, and confirmed what I already knew. No permits had been filed. Not for playground equipment, not for excavation, not even for a porta-potty installation. 0. Zilch. Not even a request for a property line review, which was step 1 in any responsible development process. It was like someone had watched a YouTube video titled, How to Build a Playground on Land You Don't Own, and decided to wing it. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. There was no record of the Magnolia Hills HOA requesting or receiving any variance, easement, or land usage exception for my lot or the surrounding parcels. In fact, the last document on record for that HOA was a routine tree removal permit from 2 years ago. What Karen had done wasn't just stupid. It was criminal. Unauthorized development, misuse of funds, trespassing, environmental violations. And she had handed it all to me on a silver platter with a plate of snickerdoodles. But as satisfying as it was to sit on this powder keg, I wasn't ready to light the fuse just yet. People like Karen don't learn from a slap on the wrist. No, I needed the community to see it happen. I wanted the parents who cheered at the playground ribbon cutting to understand exactly who had invited legal disaster into their neighborhood. So I decided to let the game continue a little longer. On Wednesday, I heard through the grapevine, well, through my neighbor Dave who couldn't resist a bit of HOA gossip, that Karen was planning a grand opening bash that weekend. Live DJ, bounce house, face painting. I nearly choked on my sandwich. It was like she wanted the city to notice. And notice we did. I sent my assistant, Clara, sharp as a whip and twice as funny, undercover as a community inspector. We dressed her down in khakis and a logo polo from the Parks and Rec department, gave her a clipboard and sent her to Karen's door. She walked away 20 minutes later with a folder of HOA flyers, a phone number, and audio recordings of Karen explaining, in her own words, that the county always slows us down, so we didn't wait for the paperwork. Clara swore Karen even winked as she said it. It was almost too easy. Karen had no idea she'd just confessed to a city official's assistant. The part that made me laugh the hardest was when Clara told me Karen proudly bragged that she'd used miscellaneous funds from the HOA treasury to get things moving faster. Translation: she'd siphoned off HOA dues without a vote. The cherry on top? At the playground bash, a kid fell off the half-installed climbing wall and broke his arm. There were no safety inspections, no liability waivers, and definitely no emergency personnel on standby. An ambulance had to come. It was all caught on video by one of the parents live-streaming the event on Facebook. The comments section exploded, some praising the idea of the playground, others asking, wait, was this even legal? I didn't have to lift a finger. Karen was digging her own grave, one entitled announcement at a time. But what truly blew me away was what showed up in my mailbox that Friday. A manila envelope from the Magnolia Hills HOA, addressed to Mr. Mark H. Non-resident parcel occupier. Inside was a typed, single-spaced cease and desist letter, riddled with formatting errors, demanding that I refrain from interfering with community enhancements and cease trespassing on common recreational grounds. They even threatened me with further legal actions if I set foot on the land again. My land. I had to sit down because I was laughing so hard I couldn't breathe. They had just legally threatened the county land use commissioner with eviction from his own property. This was it. The final ingredient I needed. I scanned the document, logged it into our records, and sent a copy to our legal department. Then I called in a favor from a friend over at Code Enforcement. He owed me one from a nasty land dispute last year, and this was the perfect way to cash in. Saturday morning came like the climax of a soap opera. It started with a few unmarked vehicles quietly rolling into the Magnolia Hills neighborhood. Then came the county trucks, one with Code Enforcement, one with Parks and Rec, one with utilities. A marked patrol car followed because at this point, potential criminal trespass had to be considered. And last but not least, a cherry-red county bulldozer. Not to demolish anything yet, but just to make a point. The HOA clubhouse was hosting a breakfast social when we arrived. Karen was mid-speech about community unity and pride when she saw us. Her face shifted from faux joy to full panic in under 3 seconds. I stepped out last, wearing my county badge on a lanyard, clipboard in hand, flanked by Clara and 2 inspectors. "Good morning," I said, with the calm of a man who'd waited weeks for this moment. "We're here to evaluate an illegal development on private land." Karen stormed toward us, waving her arms like she was trying to swat away reality. "You can't just barge in here. This is private HOA property." Clara didn't miss a beat. "No, ma'am. This parcel is privately owned by Mr. H., who has not given permission for development. Your actions have violated Municipal Code Sections 43.5, 17.2, and 19.1. She handed her the citation paperwork, already printed. Karen turned to me, eyes wide. You're with the county?" I held up my ID. "County Land Use Commissioner. You sent me a cease and desist letter last week." That was cute. The crowd was quiet. Parents, kids, neighbors. Everyone watched as violation notices were taped to the jungle gym, swings, and even the snack stand. The porta-potty was sealed shut with a bright orange sticker reading, "Unauthorized installation." Karen tried to rally the crowd. "They're overstepping. This is our community." A voice from the back of the crowd spoke up. "Wait, you said this was HOA land. You said everything was permitted." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a goldfish. I turned to the crowd. "Just so everyone is clear, no permits were filed. No inspections passed. And your HOA president used your money to build an illegal playground on land she doesn't own. That's not just a violation, it's fraud." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a plastic spork from the snack table. I didn't need to say more. Karen had done all the talking for me. And as the officers began snapping pictures and inspectors pulled out measuring wheels, I knew the best was yet to come. By the time the orange violation tags fluttered in the wind like little flags of shame, Karen was visibly unraveling. She stood stiffly near the now taped-off jungle gym, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline, her voice shrill as she tried to explain to anyone who would listen that this was all some sort of bureaucratic misunderstanding. But no one was buying it. The community members who had once applauded her speeches were now whispering among themselves, pointing at the notices and murmuring things like, "Wait, she really didn't get permits? And my HOA fees went to this mess?" The code enforcement officers were methodical. They didn't need to tear anything down, not yet. Their job was to document, measure, and flag every single violation. And there were plenty. Unsafe play structures installed without anchoring. Tripping hazards all around the perimeter. unapproved electrical work running from a nearby light post, an illegal tap-in that could have fried someone during a rainstorm. Someone even found a half-buried extension cord meant to power the DJ booth Karen had planned to bring in next weekend. But the best part, for me, was when the utilities department flagged the water line. Apparently, Karen had arranged for an irrigation system to be connected for the playground greenery, which meant someone had tampered with the property's water meter. Not just tampered, rerouted it entirely. That right there was a municipal crime. Not just an HOA infraction. That was enough to bring in criminal charges if I wanted to push it. Karen tried to keep it together. She marched over to me, her heels stabbing into the wood chips like she was trying to conquer the land through sheer foot traffic. "This is harassment," she said through gritted teeth. "You can't just bring a whole county task force into a neighborhood. This is overkill." "No, Karen," I said, flipping through the inspection notes. "What's overkill is building an entire recreational facility on land you don't own, without permits, after being warned by the actual landowner. You crossed a line. Actually, you crossed about 20 of them." She looked like she was about to explode. "I demand to speak with someone above you." I didn't even look up. "You're welcome to file a complaint with the Board of Supervisors. You'll find my name listed on the contact page." Karen's mouth fell open for the second time that week. What happened next was the inevitable spiral. The county began issuing formal citations, fines for unauthorized land development, notices for improper land use, a hefty environmental penalty for uprooting trees and failing to dispose of construction waste. Altogether, it amounted to several thousands in fines. But it didn't stop there. A community member, Marta, a quiet woman who had mostly stayed out of the HOA fray, stepped forward and asked if there was going to be a public hearing about the misuse of HOA funds. I told her, carefully and with the professionalism required of my position, that yes, once the full investigation was complete, any criminal activity would be referred to the district attorney's office, and the HOA board could be held accountable for fraudulent expenditures. Marta's eyes lit up. So, Karen could be removed from the board. I shrugged. That's up to the HOA bylaws and a vote from residents. And just like that, the spark was lit. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed near the picnic tables, people comparing fee statements, asking each other if they'd ever voted for this playground project, wondering aloud how much of their annual dues had been funneled into an illegal construction zone. Turns out, Karen hadn't just skipped the permits, she'd skipped the vote. No community meeting. No board discussion. Just a line item buried in a budget labeled Community Improvement Fund, which, by the way, had mysteriously jumped in spending by $48,000 since the start of the year. That night, I went home and opened a bottle of wine. Not to celebrate, but to calm the adrenaline. This was all unfolding fast, and I had to make sure I played it right. The last thing I needed was to be accused of conflict of interest or vendetta. So I recused myself from direct oversight of the case and handed it over to a colleague, someone who owed me a favor and knew exactly how to keep things clean. But that didn't stop me from watching the fireworks. The following week, I attended the emergency HOA meeting, not as an official but as a private citizen. It was held in the clubhouse, which suddenly felt smaller than usual. Every seat was full. Some people stood in the back. Karen sat at the front table, looking like she was about to be fed to lions. She opened the meeting with a weak attempt to defend her actions, insisting she had the community's best interest at heart, and that, sometimes red tape gets in the way of progress. Then someone asked the big question, "Did you get legal advice before starting the project?" Karen hesitated. "I spoke to someone I know who used to work in real estate law." A collective groan rolled through the room. Then another question, "Why wasn't there a community vote?" She paused again. "The board authorized it." The room erupted. "No, we didn't," shouted another board member, Greg, a normally quiet retiree who apparently had been left completely in the dark. "You pushed this through behind our backs." And just like that, the whole board turned on her. The motion to remove Karen from the board was proposed, seconded, and voted on before she even had time to collect herself. It passed unanimously. She tried to argue, but the bylaws were clear. Misuse of funds, failure to disclose spending, and negligence regarding liability were all grounds for immediate removal. Karen stormed out, but not before tossing her clipboard on the floor in a final act of melodrama. It hit the tile with a clack that echoed longer than her reputation ever would. Outside, neighbors gathered in small circles. Some looked relieved, others furious. A few people thanked me quietly. One elderly gentleman, who'd been silent the entire time, approached and shook my hand. "We've been trying to get rid of her for years," he said. "Didn't think it would take a jungle gym to do it." I smiled. "Sometimes it just takes the right kind of stupid." He chuckled and walked away, leaving me standing beneath the porch light of the now liberated clubhouse. The next day, I received a letter from the interim HOA president, apologizing for the trespass and offering to begin restitution discussions. I told them I would consider it once the structures were fully removed and the land restored to its original condition. I also included a detailed invoice for the tree damage, soil disruption, and replanting costs. By the end of the week, a local contractor had arrived with a crew to begin dismantling the playground. The swings came down first, then the slide. Then the mulch was hauled away, bucket by bucket. It was quiet. No kids. No music. Just the sound of Karen's monument to arrogance being taken apart piece by piece. And I wasn't even done with her yet. The first thing to vanish was the rainbow-colored plastic slide, taken apart by two workers who didn't even bother asking questions. They were paid contractors, hired by the new interim HOA board after Karen's expulsion, and they seemed more amused than anything. One of them joked that this was the first time he'd ever removed a playground that hadn't even been open a full month. I stood at the edge of the property, sipping a soda and watching the structure come down with the slow, steady rhythm of poetic justice. Where Karen had used bolts, screws, and HOA lies to build her monument of entitlement, these men used wrenches and unspoken understanding to dismantle it all. It was like watching the last scene of a bad community theater play where the audience had finally demanded a rewrite. After the playground was cleared, I walked the lot with a surveyor to evaluate the extent of the damage. Soil erosion from the unapproved excavation, the removal of my young maple trees, a significant trench left by a poorly planned irrigation system, and lingering debris from what had clearly been a rushed construction job. It wasn't just ugly, it was going to cost real money to fix, and that was fine, because I had a plan to recoup every cent Karen might have slithered out of the HOA, but she hadn't slithered far enough to escape legal responsibility. I filed a formal land encroachment lawsuit against the Magnolia Hills HOA. The case was clean. The evidence airtight. I had aerial photos of my untouched land before the build, followed by weekly photos documenting the progression of the unauthorized construction. There were inspection reports, violation citations, recorded confessions, and community complaints. It wasn't just an open and shut case. It was a case that walked itself into the courthouse and politely asked for justice. The HOA's new board, desperate to clean their hands, quickly offered a settlement. They agreed to fund the full restoration of the lot, cover damages for the trees and landscape destruction, and refund all illegally spent HOA funds back to the resident. But I wasn't finished. I had one more move to make, and it involved turning Karen's little operation into a case study in what not to do when managing a neighborhood association. I requested that the structures from the playground, now fully disassembled, be auctioned off as scrap to the highest bidder. It wasn't just about recouping costs. It was about making sure that every part of this playground was publicly dismantled, sold, and used for something lawful. The swings, the climbing dome, the picnic tables, all of it went up on a government auction site. Surprisingly, most of it sold quickly. A local school district bought the picnic tables. The climbing dome went to a church. The swing set was purchased by a man who ran a summer camp. As far as I was concerned, it was the first time any of it was being put to proper use. Karen, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. She hadn't shown her face at any of the community meetings since her removal, and she'd stopped responding to emails from the board. But the HOA's new treasurer confirmed that she had written herself several reimbursement checks during the construction period. They were labeled as miscellaneous expenses, but the dollar amounts matched suspiciously well with some of the contractor invoices. It looked like she had paid herself under the table. That information was forwarded to the local prosecutor, who opened an investigation into financial misconduct. It was during one of the restoration visits to my land that I noticed a small crowd gathered near the clubhouse. Curious, I walked over and discovered it was the first open HOA meeting since Karen's exit. There was no yelling, no passive-aggressive cookie trays, no patronizing lectures. People were actually having discussions, plans were being proposed. A vote was being taken on whether to install traffic calming signs on the main neighborhood street. It was, shockingly, functional. And then someone spotted me and waved me over. They asked if I would consider serving as an advisor to the board. Not an official position, just a helpful voice with experience in land use and community development. I politely declined. I told them I was flattered, but my focus was better spent ensuring the county enforced fair land use across all neighborhoods, not just one. Still, I promised to be available if they ever needed guidance, and, maybe more importantly, to ensure that what happened with Karen never happened again. But my favorite part of the entire affair came a few weeks later. The land was nearly back to normal. Grass seed had been planted, native plants lined the edges, and the replacement trees were already starting to grow. The soil was healthy. The property felt mine again. And to give it the final touch, I installed a modest, tasteful sign at the front corner of the lot. Nothing flashy, just a hand-carved wooden plaque that read, "Private property, unauthorized playgrounds will be demolished." The sign wasn't just a joke, it was a message. A quiet reminder that entitlement has limit. That just because someone wears a sun hat and wields a clipboard doesn't mean they own the world. And that assuming someone's powerless just because they don't argue right away might be the last mistake you ever make. Around the same time, I received a tip from someone inside the HOA board. Apparently, Karen had tried to use the HOA email list to send a mass message pleading for sympathy, claiming she was victimized by government overreach. The message didn't go over well. Within hours, several residents replied, all with receipts of how much their dues had increased under her leadership and screenshots of her false promises about permits being already approved. Someone even replied with a gif of a playground slide falling over. Soon after that, her name disappeared from the HOA's historical board list on their website. The interim president, Marta, told me they had voted to remove her access to all community platforms and restricted her ability to represent the neighborhood in any formal capacity. She wasn't just out, she was erased. And then came the cherry on top. A neighbor mentioned, in casual passing, that Karen's house was going up for sale. Not publicly, quietly. She was trying to offload it before things got worse. Rumor had it the fines and pending legal fees had caught up to her, and with the community no longer tolerating her presence, she had little reason to stay. One afternoon, as I walked past her house, I noticed a discreet for sale sign tucked low in her flower bed. I smiled. It was poetic. Her empire of mulch, slides, and clipboard commands had crumbled. Her legacy? A financial mess, a criminal investigation, and a name that no one spoke without rolling their eyes. And as her house sat on the market, the only thing visible from her backyard was the neatly restored property next door. Mine. No swings. No jungle gym. Just grass, trees, and a small compost bin sitting right at the fence line. A bin I labeled, in permanent marker, Karen's Playground. Because some stories don't need to end with a bang. Some end with a quiet, well-placed jab that stinks just enough to linger. Spring melted into summer, and with each passing week, the land that had once been a monument to Karen's unchecked arrogance began to flourish. The grass came in thick and healthy, the new trees were thriving, and the privacy hedges I planted along the fence line added a perfect natural wall that separated my lot from the rest of the neighborhood. There was something deeply satisfying about watching the land heal, like nature itself was trying to forget the brief and unfortunate era of unauthorized monkey bars and ill-conceived community bounce houses. What once looked like a chaotic playground now resembled a serene private retreat, which was exactly what I had intended for the property all along. The residents of Magnolia Hills had moved on, too. The HOA had stabilized under new leadership, led by Marta and a couple of other neighbors who actually understood things like transparency, budgeting, and basic legal compliance. The mood at the community meetings was no longer tense or combative. There were still disagreements, of course. No neighborhood is perfect, but at least they were resolved with votes and not with threats and hissy fit. Someone even proposed adding a legitimate community garden in a shared lot, which passed with enthusiasm. Funny how people are more willing to participate when they aren't being bullied by a woman who thinks the law bends to her brunch schedule. Karen's house remained on the market longer than expected. I kept tabs on it, mostly out of curiosity. She dropped the price twice, which must have stung. When a prospective buyer came to view the home, I happened to be on my lot planting some wildflowers. They waved politely. I smiled back, gesturing toward the yard that had once been ground zero for Karen's illegal project. "Nice neighborhood," the buyer said. I replied, "It got a lot nicer recently." Eventually, the house sold. Karen was gone within the week. No goodbye, no notice, not even a final email blast defending herself. Just a moving truck, a few loud arguments with the new HOA president on her front lawn, and a departure so quiet it almost felt like the neighborhood itself exhaled when she left. Her car pulled out of the cul-de-sac one last time, never to return. Her house was bought by a retired couple who kept to themselves, mowed their lawn on schedule, and never once tried to repurpose someone else's property. With Karen gone, I decided it was time to enjoy my land the way I originally intended. I built a small gazebo in the corner of the lot, fully permitted, of course, and set up a few comfortable chairs around a fire pit. On weekends, I'd invite friends over for grilled food, a few drinks, and some peace under the stars. Sometimes neighbors from the community stopped by, not to complain or argue, but just to say hi or ask about my wildflower garden. A few even thanked me again for what I'd done, not just for defending my own land, but for putting an end to Karen's reign of error. Still, there was one final loose thread I couldn't resist tugging. A few weeks after Karen's departure, I received an anonymous tip, clearly from someone on the new HOA board, that her backyard pool had been installed with questionable drainage lines. Apparently, when she oversaw the pool's resurfacing last year, she directed the runoff through an unauthorized pipe that emptied directly into the storm drain, bypassing the required filtration. It wasn't a massive environmental violation, but it was enough to warrant attention. And since the complaint had been forwarded to the county's Environmental Review Office, I just so happened to sign the inspection order myself. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. I wanted the record to show that no matter how much she'd tried to steamroll over rules and boundaries, they eventually rolled back with full force. Karen had always acted like the rules were optional for people like her. That she could manipulate systems, weaponize ignorance, and bluff her way through life without consequences. But rules don't disappear just because you're loud or confident or armed with a clipboard. When the fine came through, $12,000 for improper drainage and unpermitted alterations to county-regulated systems, it landed at her new address via certified mail. I didn't need to be there to see her reaction. Just knowing it arrived was enough. To cap things off, the community decided to hold a neighborhood appreciation picnic, the first in years. I was invited, and while I considered politely declining, curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived, I found a long table of potluck dishes, kids playing with chalk on the sidewalk, and a giant homemade banner that read, "Thanks for helping us reclaim Magnolia Hills." I wasn't the only one being thanked. Other residents who'd spoken up, written letters, or helped investigate Karen's behavior were also being recognized. Still, I'll admit, seeing my name handwritten on a thank you card taped to the dessert table felt surprisingly meaningful. Later in the evening, someone jokingly asked me if I had plans to build anything else on my lot now that it was back to being rightfully mine. I shrugged. Probably just more flowers and a few birdhouses. Maybe a hammock. The last thing I want is another jungle gym war. The crowd laughed and someone raised a toast. This time with sparkling cider, not HOA threats. We clinked plastic cups and shared stories about Karen's greatest hits, each one more absurd than the last. Someone recounted the time she tried to issue a noise complaint against a wind chime. Another neighbor confessed that they once replaced her garden gnome with a rubber duck just to see how long it would take her to notice. It was the kind of laughter that only comes after a long battle, part relief, part disbelief that any of it actually happened. As the sun set behind the freshly mowed lawns and trimmed hedges, I looked over at my lot one more time. No swings. No caution tape. Just quiet grass and the occasional chirp of birds returning to the trees I had planted. It was, finally, exactly what it was supposed to be. Before leaving the picnic, I walked over to the compost bin I had cheekily labeled Karen's playground and tossed in a handful of apple peels from my plate. A couple of people saw the label and snickered. One neighbor leaned over and whispered, "Honestly, it suits her better than the clubhouse ever did." I smiled and nodded. That bin, like the land it sat on, had a clear purpose. And unlike Karen, it knew its place.